The bitter wind howled across the desolate plains of New Mexico territory, carrying stinging pellets of snow that bit into Delia Winters' exposed skin like tiny needles. She clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing it provided little protection against the unexpected blizzard that had descended upon the land with frightening speed. Her horse had bolted an hour earlier, spooked by the sudden whiteout conditions, leaving her stranded miles from Oro Grande with night falling rapidly. "Just keep walking," she whispered to herself, her voice immediately snatched away by the wind. "Just keep walking." But each step became more difficult than the last, her leather boots sinking into the deepening snow, her fingers and toes growing numb from the cold. The year was 1879, and Delia was beginning to understand why the locals spoke of winter with such reverence and fear. She'd been a fool to attempt the journey back to town so late in the day, especially with the darkening clouds that had been building on the horizon. But after visiting the sickly widow Johnson at her remote homestead, Delia had been eager to return to the warmth of her small room above the general store where she worked. Now, as the visibility dropped to mere feet in front of her, Delia wondered if she'd ever see that cramped but cozy room again. The howling of the wind seemed to change pitch, almost like the distant rumble of hoofbeats, but she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks, desperate for rescue. Then the sound grew louder. Delia stopped, straining to hear through the wall of white that surrounded her. The rhythmic pounding was unmistakable now, a horse approaching. She opened her mouth to call out, but her voice emerged as little more than a rasp, her throat parched despite the moisture in the air. A shadow materialized in the swirling snow, growing larger and more defined until she could make out the silhouette of a rider. Delia raised her arms weakly, waving them in a desperate plea to be seen. The horse slowed, and the rider turned in her direction. "Hello there," a deep voice called out, barely audible above the storm. "Are you lost, madam?" "Yes." Delia managed to shout back, relief flooding through her body so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. The rider guided his horse closer, and as he came into view, Delia saw a tall man with a snow-dusted hat pulled low over his face. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and thick gloves, his entire appearance speaking of someone who understood the dangers of a territory winter. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. Up close, she could see his face now strong features, a square jaw darkened with stubble, and piercing blue eyes that assessed her condition with concern. "This storm's only getting worse." "My horse bolted," Delia explained, her teeth chattering so badly she could barely form the words. Without hesitation, the man shrugged off his heavy coat. "You're half frozen." He wrapped the coat around her shoulders, the residual warmth from his body immediately beginning to thaw her frozen limbs. The coat enveloped her completely, its weight both substantial and comforting. "I can't take your coat," she protested weakly, even as her fingers clutched the edges of the garment, pulling it tighter around herself. "You can and you will," he replied firmly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I've got layers beneath, and I'm not the one turning blue." He removed his gloves next and handed them to her. "Put these on before your fingers freeze solid." The man's commanding presence brooked no argument, and Delia slipped her hands into the still warm gloves. They were comically large on her small hands, but the relief was immediate. "I'm Adam Northrup," he said, taking the reins of his horse. "I've got a cabin about a mile east of here. We need to get you somewhere warm and fast." "Delia Winters," she managed through chattering teeth. "I work at the general store in Oro Grande. You're a long way from town, Miss Winters." He guided her toward his horse. "Can you ride?" Delia nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain she had the strength to stay mounted. Adam must have read the doubt in her expression because he shook his head. "We'll ride together. I'll keep you steady." He helped her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. One strong arm circled her waist, holding her securely against his chest as he gathered the reins with his other hand. "Hold on tight," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "I promise I'll get you somewhere safe." As the horse began moving through the deepening snow, Delia found herself leaning back against the solid warmth of Adam's chest. Despite the howling blizzard around them and her recent brush with death, She felt an unexpected sense of security in the embrace of a stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, uncertain if he could even hear her over the wind. His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "I keep my promises, Miss Winters. Always have, always will." The journey to Adam's cabin seemed both interminable and fleeting. Delia drifted in and out of awareness, the cold having sapped her strength more than she realized. She was vaguely conscious of Adam's steady presence behind her, his occasional quiet words of encouragement, and the rhythmic motion of the horse beneath them. When they finally arrived at a small cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees, Delia was barely conscious. Adam dismounted swiftly and lifted her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to the door, somehow managing to open it while still holding her securely in his arms. The warmth of the cabin's interior washed over Delia's face, and she became aware of the crackling sound of a fire that must have been left burning in the hearth. Adam placed her gently in a chair near the flames. "Stay here," he said, as if she had the strength to go anywhere else. "I need to see to my horse, then I'll be right back." True to his word, he returned minutes later, stomping snow from his boots and running a hand through his dark hair, now damp from melted snow. He moved with purpose around the small cabin, adding wood to the fire, filling a kettle with water and retrieving blankets from a trunk. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, placing the blankets beside her. "I'll turn my back. There's a screen in the corner you can change behind if you prefer." Delia hesitated, the propriety instilled in her since childhood warring with the practical need to remove her damp, freezing clothing. Adam seemed to sense her discomfort. "Miss Winters, I'm not looking to compromise your virtue. I'm trying to keep you from freezing to death." His voice softened. "I've got a sister back in Missouri. If she were in your situation, I'd hope someone would do the same for her." Something in his earnest expression convinced Delia. She nodded weakly and made her way behind the screen he'd indicated. With trembling fingers, she managed to remove her sodden dress, petticoats, and stockings, wrapping herself in one of the blankets he'd provided. It was thick and surprisingly soft, smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke. "I'm decent," she called out, her voice still shaky. Adam turned back, assessing her with concern rather than interest. "Sit by the fire. I'll make you something hot to drink." As Delia settled back into the chair, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, she watched Adam move about the cabin. For a bachelor's dwelling, it was surprisingly tidy and well organized. A small table with 2 chairs stood in one corner, bookshelves lined one wall, and the bed in the far corner was neatly made. It spoke of a man who valued order quite different from the rowdy cowboys who occasionally passed through Oro Grande. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, trying to keep her mind occupied as feeling painfully returned to her extremities. Adam placed a steaming cup of something that smelled like coffee with cinnamon into her hands. "Going on 3 years now. I raise horses on the property, train them for the army mostly." "I didn't know there was a horse ranch so close to Oro Grande." "I keep to myself," he said simply, pulling the second chair closer to the fire. "Towns never held much appeal for me." Delia sipped the hot drink, grateful for its warming effect. "That explains why I haven't seen you around." "I've been in Oro Grande for almost a year now. What brought you out west, if you don't mind my asking?" Adam leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes attentive. "My parents died of influenza back in Pennsylvania. There wasn't much left for me there." Delia stared into the flames, the memories still raw despite the passage of time. "My aunt in Oro Grande offered me work and a place to stay. It seemed like the sensible choice." Adam nodded. "The West is full of people looking for fresh starts." "And you?" Delia asked. "What's your story?" A shadow crossed his features. "Served in the army after the war, saw too much. Decided I preferred the company of horses to most people." He offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They're more honest, at least." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Delia felt herself relaxing as warmth gradually returned to her body. The day's trauma, combined with the heat of the fire and the comfort of the blanket, made her eyelids grow heavy. "You should rest," Adam said, noticing her struggle to stay awake. You can take the bed, I'll sleep in the chair. I couldn't possibly, Delia began to protest. You can and you will, Adam said, echoing his earlier words about the coat with a hint of amusement. You've been through an ordeal today. Besides, I've slept in worse places than a chair by a warm fire. Too exhausted to argue further, Delia made her way to the bed. As she settled under the covers, she watched Adam bank the fire for the night. There was something comforting about his methodical movements, his quiet competence. Thank you, she said softly, for saving my life today. Adam looked up, his expression solemn in the firelight. Get some rest, Miss Winters. We'll see about getting you back to town when the storm breaks. As Delia drifted into sleep, her last thought was that despite the danger she'd faced, there was something almost fated about this day, as if the blizzard had blown her not just into the path of Adam Northrup, but into the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Morning arrived with stillness. The absence of the wind's howl woke Delia before anything else. She opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings, momentarily confused until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was in Adam Northrup's cabin, alive because he had found her in the blizzard. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting a golden rectangle on the wooden floor. Adam was nowhere to be seen, but the fire had been built up again, and a pot of something that smelled like oatmeal simmered at its edge. Delia sat up, suddenly aware that she was wearing only her chemise beneath the blankets. Her clothes from yesterday were laid out near the fire, now dry but hopelessly wrinkled. She dressed quickly behind the screen, grateful that Adam had given her privacy. The cabin door opened just as she finished arranging her hair as best she could without a mirror. Adam entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He stopped short when he saw her standing there. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a hint of gruffness that hadn't been there the night before. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." Delia smoothed her skirts nervously. In the clear light of day, she was suddenly very aware that she had spent the night unchaperoned in a stranger's home, the kind of situation that would set tongues wagging in Oro Grande. "I should return to town as soon as possible." Adam nodded, setting down the wood beside the hearth. "The storm's passed, but there's a good 3 feet of snow on the ground. The trail to town won't be easy." He gestured to the pot by the fire. "You should eat something first." "I've already fed the horses." "Horses?" Delia questioned. "You have more than one." A small smile lifted the corner of Adam's mouth. "I did mention I raised them, didn't I? But I was referring to yours. She showed up at my corral this morning, looking no worse for the adventure." Relief flooded through Delia. "Oh, that's wonderful news. I was so worried about her. She's a smart animal, found shelter during the worst of it, I'd wager." Adam moved to the fire, stirring the contents of the pot. "Once you've eaten, I'll ride with you back to town. These drifts are treacherous if you don't know what to look for." Delia wanted to decline his offer, to prove she could manage on her own, but the memory of the blinding snow and her near-death experience was too fresh. Instead, she nodded her acceptance and sat at the small table while Adam served up 2 bowls of oatmeal sweetened with dried apples and honey. They ate in companionable silence, and Delia found herself studying Adam when he wasn't looking. In the daylight, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His dark hair had a slight wave to it, and his eyes were even more striking in the sunlight, a clear, intense blue that reminded her of summer skies. After breakfast, Adam helped her saddle her mare, checking the cinch carefully before allowing her to mount. His own horse, a magnificent black stallion, stood patiently nearby, already saddled and waiting. "That's quite an animal," Delia commented, admiring the stallion's powerful build and intelligent eyes. "Midnight's the best horse I've ever owned," Adam said, patting the animal's neck with obvious affection. "Bred and trained him myself. He's the foundation of my stock." They set off toward Oro Grande, the horses picking their way carefully through the snow-covered landscape. The world had been transformed overnight into a glittering wonderland, sunlight reflecting off the snow with almost blinding intensity. Despite the beauty, Delia couldn't help but shiver, remembering how this same pristine landscape had nearly claimed her life. Cold. Adam asked, noticing her discomfort. No, just remembering, he nodded in understanding. Nature out here demands respect. The territories don't forgive carelessness. I've learned that lesson rather dramatically, Delia admitted. I won't be caught unprepared again. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves and the occasional call of a bird. Delia found herself stealing glances at her companion, curiosity building about this solitary man who had saved her life. May I ask you something, Mr. Northrup? Adam, he corrected. After sharing a cabin through a blizzard, I think we can dispense with formalities. Delia smiled despite herself. Adam, then, why do you live so far from town? Most ranchers I've met make a point of coming into Oro Grande regularly, if only for supplies and companionship. Adam was quiet for so long that Delia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if carefully choosing each word. After the war, I served with the cavalry in the Dakota Territory, saw things there that. He paused, his jaw tightening. Let's just say I came to prefer solitude. People ask too many questions, expect too many explanations. I'm sorry, Delia said softly, regretting her prying. I didn't mean to, it's all right, Adam interrupted, his expression softening slightly. You're not the first to wonder why a man chooses to live apart, but some wounds heal better in quiet places. They crested a small rise, and the buildings of Oro Grande came into view in the distance. The sight brought mixed feelings to Delia, relief at returning to the familiarity of her life, but also a strange reluctance to part from Adam's company. Will you come into town for supplies while you're here? She asked, trying to sound casual. Adam seemed to consider the question carefully. I suppose I should. The storm came on so suddenly, I didn't have a chance to stock up. As they approached the outskirts of Oro Grande, Delia became increasingly aware of how their arrival might appear to the townspeople. A young, unmarried woman returning after a night's absence, accompanied by an unknown man, it was the stuff of gossip that could last for months. Her worries proved well-founded. As they rode down the main street, faces appeared in windows and shopkeepers paused in their snow clearing to stare. Delia held her head high, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. Surviving a blizzard was hardly a scandal. They stopped outside the general store, where a plump, gray-haired woman burst through the door before Delia could even dismount. Delia Winters. The woman exclaimed, her face a mixture of relief and indignation. We've been worried sick about you. When you didn't return last night, Jackson was organizing a search party for First Light. I'm fine, Mrs. Simmons, Delia assured her employer as Adam helped her down from the saddle. My horse bolted during the blizzard. If Mr. Northrup hadn't found me, I'd likely have frozen to death. Mrs. Simmons turned her attention to Adam, assessing him with the shrewd gaze that had intimidated many a customer who tried to haggle too aggressively. Then it seems we owe you our gratitude, Mr. Northrup, she said, her tone warming slightly. Delia's become quite dear to us all. Adam tipped his hat respectfully. Anyone would have done the same, madam. Perhaps, Mrs. Simmons replied, not sounding entirely convinced. But not everyone would have brought her back safe and sound. You must join us for dinner tonight. My husband will want to thank you properly. Delia watched Adam's face, seeing the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly at the invitation. This man was unaccustomed to social obligations. That's very kind, but I have animals to tend to, he began. Nonsense, Mrs. Simmons interrupted, a woman accustomed to getting her way. The animals can spare you for one evening, 6 o'clock sharp. We're just above the store here. With that, she ushered Delia inside, leaving Adam little opportunity to refuse further. As the door closed behind them, Delia glanced back through the window to see Adam still standing beside his horse, looking somewhat bemused. Now then, Mrs. Simmons said, her voice lowering conspirationally once they were alone in the store, you must tell me everything. Who is this mysterious Mr. Northrup, and where did you spend the night? Delia sighed, knowing that the truth, however innocent, would feed the gossip mill for weeks to come. But she was too honest by nature to fabricate a more convenient story. He's a horse breeder who lives east of town. I spent the night in his cabin, he gave me the bed and slept in a chair. She met Mrs. Simmons' gaze directly. "He was a perfect gentleman who saved my life, and that's all there is to tell." Mrs. Simmons studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Well, you're a sensible girl, and I believe you, but you know how people talk in small towns. You'd best be prepared." "I know," Delia acknowledged, removing her shawl and hanging it on a peg. "But the truth is the truth, and I won't dishonor Mr. Northrup's kindness by acting as if I have something to hide." A smile spread across Mrs. Simmons' round face. "That's why I like you, Delia. Backbone. Now go upstairs and freshen up. You look like you've been dragged behind a wild horse." As Delia climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself hoping that Adam would indeed come to dinner. There was something about him that intrigued her, a depth beneath his reserved exterior that she felt drawn to explore. And if she was entirely honest with herself, the memory of being held securely in his arms as they rode through the blizzard had stayed with her, stirring feelings she hadn't expected. Adam Northrup stood outside the general store long after Delia had disappeared inside, his thoughts in turmoil. He hadn't planned on becoming entangled in the social fabric of Oro Grande. His carefully constructed solitude now faced the threat of dinner invitations and grateful townspeople, all because he couldn't ride past a woman stranded in a blizzard. Yet as he mounted midnight and headed toward the mercantile for supplies, Adam found he couldn't regret his actions. The memory of Delia Winters standing alone in the swirling snow, her delicate face pinched with cold and fear, had stirred something in him he'd thought long dead, a protective instinct, yes, but something more as well. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to examine too closely. The mercantile was busy with townsfolk replenishing supplies after the storm. Adam felt eyes on him as he entered, the inevitable curiosity of a small town confronted with a stranger. He kept his interaction with the proprietor brief and businesslike, purchasing coffee, flour, sugar, and other necessities before making a hasty exit. As he secured his purchases to Midnight's saddle, a voice called out behind him, "Mr. Northrup, isn't it?" Adam turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching, his silver badge glinting in the winter sunlight. "Sheriff Jackson," the man introduced himself, extending a hand. "Heard you brought in Miss Winters this morning." Adam shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip. "Word travels fast." "Small town," Jackson replied with a shrug. "Not much happens in Oro Grande that everyone doesn't know about by sundown. Wanted to thank you personally. Miss Winters is well liked around here." "I did what anyone would do," Adam said, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. The sheriff studied him with interest. "Been meaning to ride out to your place, actually. Army's looking for good horseflesh, and your name came up in conversation with a captain passing through last month." Adam raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize my operation was known to the Army out here." "Your reputation precedes you," Jackson said. "Northrup-bred horses are spoken of highly in certain circles. I'd be interested in seeing your stock myself if you're amenable." Before Adam could formulate a polite refusal, the sheriff continued, "Perhaps after the Simmons dinner tonight." "I understand you've been invited." Trapped, Adam simply nodded. "Seems I have it that." The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. "Looking forward to it. Been too long since we had new blood in town." As Jackson walked away, Adam sighed. His careful isolation was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. And the strangest part was that a small, traitorous part of him welcomed the prospect of seeing Delia Winters again, of sharing a meal and conversation in a warm room while winter raged outside. He spent the rest of the day at the livery stable, checking on Delia's mare and making minor repairs to his saddle to pass the time. When the town clock struck 5:30, he resigned himself to his fate and headed back to the general store, having borrowed a razor from the livery owner to at least make himself presentable. Mrs. Simmons answered his knock promptly, as if she'd been waiting by the door. "Mr. Northrup." "Right on time. Do come in." The apartment above the store was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with a large table already set for dinner in the center of the main room. Mr. Simmons, a thin, scholarly-looking man who seemed the complete opposite of his robust wife, greeted Adam warmly. "We're indebted to you, sir," he said, pumping Adam's hand. "Our Delia has become like a daughter to us. Is she?" Adam began, looking around the room, still getting ready. Mrs. Simmons supplied with a knowing smile. "Sheriff Jackson will be joining us as well. He had some business to attend to first." Adam was shown to a comfortable chair and offered a glass of whiskey, which he accepted gratefully. The Simmons were easy conversationalists, not pressing him with too many personal questions, but keeping the discussion flowing naturally around topics like the severity of the storm and predictions for the winter ahead. When Delia finally entered the room, Adam nearly choked on his whiskey. Gone was the bedraggled woman he'd rescued from the blizzard. In her place stood a vision in a simple blue dress that perfectly matched her eyes, her chestnut hair arranged in soft curls around her face. She wore no jewelry save for a simple silver locket, but she needed none to enhance her natural beauty. "Good evening, Mr. Northrup," she said, a slight flush coloring her cheeks as she noticed his stunned expression. "Thank you for coming." Adam stood quickly, suddenly acutely aware of his rough appearance despite his efforts to clean up. "Miss Winters, you look recovered." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Amazing what a proper bath and clean clothes can do." Sheriff Jackson arrived moments later, and they all sat down to a hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. The conversation remained light, though Adam noticed how Jackson paid particular attention to Delia, his admiration evident in his every glance. A strange, unexpected pang of jealousy shot through Adam at the realization. He had no claim on Delia Winters, no right to feel possessive after a single night of purely innocent circumstances. Yet he couldn't deny the tightness in his chest when she laughed at something the sheriff said, or the way his eyes kept returning to her face across the table. After dinner, while Mrs. Simmons served coffee and apple pie, the conversation turned inevitably to Adam's background. "So, Mr. Northrup," Mr. Simmons began, "what brought you to New Mexico territory? Delia mentioned you breed horses." "Yes," Adam replied, grateful for a safe topic. "I started with just Midnight and 2 mares. Now I have a modest operation, about 20 head, focusing on strength and endurance. The Army's been my main customer." "And before that," Mrs. Simmons asked, "you sound educated. Were you always a horseman?" Adam hesitated, uncomfortable with the personal turn. "I studied engineering before the war, served as an officer afterward." "With the 7th Cavalry, I understand," Sheriff Jackson added, "under Custer." A heavy silence fell over the table. The disaster at Little Bighorn was still fresh in everyone's mind, even 3 years later. "I left before that," Adam said shortly, his tone making it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Delia, perhaps sensing his discomfort, deftly changed the subject. "Mrs. Simmons, this pie is exceptional. I must get your secret for keeping the crust so flaky." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Adam noticed Delia watching him with new interest in her eyes. He'd revealed more than he intended, not in words, but in the tension that had gripped him at the mention of his military past. When the evening finally drew to a close, Adam found himself both relieved and reluctant to leave. The warmth of the Simmons home and Delia's presence had been unexpectedly pleasant, a reminder of what he'd deliberately left behind in choosing solitude. "I'll walk you to the livery," Delia said as he prepared to depart. Before Mrs. Simmons could object to the propriety, she added, "It's just down the street, and I'd like a breath of fresh air." Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars glittering overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they walked slowly toward the livery stable. "Thank you for coming tonight," Delia said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I know social gatherings aren't easy for you." Adam glanced at her, surprised by her perception. Was it that obvious? "Only to someone who was watching carefully," she admitted, then quickly added, "I wanted to be sure you weren't too uncomfortable after all you've done for me." They reached the livery and Adam paused before going inside. "Will you be all right now? After your ordeal?" Delia nodded, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Thanks to you, but I was wondering if perhaps I might see your horse ranch sometime." "To properly thank the mare who found her way to your corral and indirectly saved my life." The request caught Adam off guard. The idea of Delia visiting his home not as someone in need of rescue, but as a guest stirred conflicting emotions. His instinct for solitude warred with a growing desire to see her again. "I'd like that," he found himself saying, surprising himself as much as her. Perhaps when the snow melts a bit more. Delia's smile was worth the momentary discomfort of extending the invitation. "I'll hold you to that, Adam Northrup." As he rode home under the star-filled sky, Adam wondered what he'd set in motion by rescuing Delia Winters from that blizzard. He'd wrapped her in his coat and made a promise of safety, never imagining that the encounter might thaw something frozen inside himself as well. The weeks following the blizzard brought a gradual warming trend to the New Mexico territory. Snow melted, revealing patches of dormant grass beneath, and the trails between ranches and towns became passable once more. Life in Oro Grande returned to its regular rhythms, though Delia found herself the subject of curious glances and the occasional pointed question about her adventure with the reclusive horse breeder. She deflected such inquiries with practiced grace, neither encouraging the gossip nor showing irritation at the invasiveness. In truth, her thoughts often strayed to Adam Northrup, wondering about his solitary life and whether he ever thought of her. She told herself her interest was merely gratitude and natural curiosity, nothing more. Yet, when Sheriff Jackson began calling at the store with increasing frequency, bringing small gifts and transparent excuses to see her, Delia found herself making polite but firm excuses to avoid his company. The sheriff was a good man, handsome, established, respected, exactly the kind of suitor her parents would have approved of, but something held her back from encouraging his attentions. "You're being foolish," she chided herself one morning as she swept the store before opening. Pining after a man who clearly prefers his own company to anyone else's. For Adam had not returned to town since that dinner at the Simmons, though nearly a month had passed. His invitation for her to visit his ranch seemed to have been forgotten, or perhaps had never been sincere to begin with. The bell above the door jingled, startling Delia from her thoughts. She looked up, expecting Mrs. Simmons returning from her errand to the post office. Instead, Adam Northrup stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning light. "Good morning, Miss Winters," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Delia's heart performed an unexpected leap in her chest. "Mr. Northrup, not at all. We're just about to open." She smoothed her apron, suddenly self-conscious of her workday appearance. "What brings you to town?" "I came to see if your offer still stands," he said, his direct gaze meeting hers. "To visit the ranch." Surprise and pleasure warred in Delia's expression. "Of course it does. I didn't think you. That is, I wasn't sure if you meant it." A hint of a smile touched Adam's lips. "I'm a man of my word, Miss Winters. The trails are clear enough now, and I thought perhaps if you're free this Sunday." "I am," Delia replied, perhaps too quickly. She felt heat rising to her cheeks and busied herself with arranging items on a nearby shelf. "That is, the store is closed Sundays, and Mrs. Simmons has been encouraging me to take more time for myself. Then I'll come for you after church, around noon." Delia nodded, trying to contain the ridiculous happiness bubbling up inside her. That would be lovely. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Adam cleared his throat. "I should let you get back to work. I have some supplies to purchase at the mercantile." "Will you be staying in town for lunch?" Delia asked, then immediately wished she could retract the too eager question. Adam's expression softened. "I wish I could, but I have horses to tend to. Sunday, though." As he turned to leave, the bell above the door jingled again and Sheriff Jackson entered. The two men exchanged nods, a strange tension suddenly filling the air. "Northrup," Jackson acknowledged, "didn't expect to see you in town again so soon." "Sheriff," Adam returned evenly. "Just making arrangements with Miss Winters, if you'll excuse me." As Adam departed, Jackson watched him go with an expression Delia couldn't quite decipher. When he turned back to her, his usual easy smile was firmly in place. "Arrangements?" he inquired, his tone deliberately casual. "Mr. Northrup has invited me to visit his horse ranch on Sunday," Delia explained, keeping her voice light. "I expressed interest in seeing it after, After the blizzard. Did you now? Jackson removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Riding out there alone might not be the wisest choice, Delia. Northrup keeps to himself for a reason, you know. Something in his tone raised Delia's hackles. And what reason might that be, Sheriff? Jackson shrugged. Man leaves the cavalry right before Little Bighorn, disappears for a time, then shows up here with enough money to buy land and horses. Makes a person wonder. It makes some people gossip, you mean, Delia replied, more sharply than she intended. Mr. Northrup saved my life. I'll not listen to insinuations against his character. The sheriff's expression hardened momentarily before he forced a laugh. Just looking out for your welfare, Miss Winters. No offense intended. He placed his hat back on his head. Perhaps I'll ride along with you Sunday, for propriety's sake. That won't be necessary, Delia said firmly. Mrs. Simmons has already agreed to accompany me. It was a lie, but one she could make true before Sunday. She'd seen the way Jackson and Adam had regarded each other, and she had no desire to subject either man to the other's company for an entire afternoon. Jackson looked as if he might argue further, but Mrs. Simmons chose that moment to return, her arms full of mail and packages. The sheriff tipped his hat to both women and departed with a promise to return later in the week. What was that about? Mrs. Simmons asked, her shrewd eyes taking in Delia's flushed cheeks. And was that Adam Northrup I saw leaving as I approached? Delia explained about the invitation, ending with her impulsive lie to Sheriff Jackson. I'm sorry to involve you without asking first, but would you mind terribly coming along, just for a few hours? Mrs. Simmons studied her with knowing eyes. Delia Winters, are you sweet on that solitary horseman of yours? He's hardly mine, Delia protested, avoiding the main question. And it's merely a social call to thank him properly for his kindness. Mrs. Simmons murmured skeptically. Well, I suppose someone ought to chaperone, though at your age it's hardly required. And I admit I'm curious about this ranch of his. People say he breeds the finest horses in the territory. Relief flooded through Delia. Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. Don't thank me yet, the older woman warned with a twinkle in her eye. I plan to ask all the questions you're too polite to voice. That man has secrets, and I intend to uncover at least a few of them before the day is through. Sunday dawned clear and mild, with a hint of spring in the air despite the calendar still showing February. Delia dressed with particular care, choosing a riding habit of deep green that Mrs. Simmons had helped her alter from one of her aunt's old dresses. She pinned her hair in a simple but elegant style, and allowed herself a dab of rose water behind each ear, a small extravagance she usually saved for special occasions. My, Mrs. Simmons commented when Delia descended to the apartment's sitting room. If I didn't know better, I'd think this was more than a casual visit to see some horses. Delia felt her cheeks warm. I simply want to make a good impression. On the horses or the rancher, Mrs. Simmons teased, buttoning her own coat. Either way, you look lovely, dear. Adam arrived precisely at noon, riding midnight and leading a gentle-looking chestnut mare for Delia. Mrs. Simmons would follow in her husband's buggy, as she preferred not to ride horseback at my age, as she put it. When Adam saw Delia emerge from the store, he removed his hat, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. Something in his expression, a momentary widening of his eyes, a softening around his mouth sent a pleasant flutter through Delia's stomach. Miss Winters, he greeted her, helping her mount the chestnut. You look. He paused, seeming to search for an appropriate word. Well, thank you, Delia replied, adjusting her skirts over the side saddle. As do you, it was true. Adam had clearly made an effort for the occasion, wearing a clean shirt and what appeared to be a new vest under his riding coat. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and he'd shaved closely, revealing a strong jawline usually hidden beneath stubble. The ride to Adam's ranch took nearly an hour, but passed quickly as Adam pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the territory. He seemed more relaxed away from town, more willing to engage in conversation. Mrs. Simmons followed at a discreet distance in the buggy, allowing them a measure of privacy while maintaining the appearance of propriety. There it is, Adam said finally, gesturing ahead to where a neat collection of buildings came into view. Nothing fancy, but it suits my purposes. Delia was impressed, despite his modest description. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a substantial log structure with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Nearby stood a large barn, several corrals, and what appeared to be bunkhouses, though Adam had never mentioned having hired hands. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You've built all this in just 3 years." A shadow crossed Adam's face. Some of it was already here. Previous owner was forced to sell quickly, but I've expanded considerably. As they approached, Delia noticed activity around one of the corrals, 2 men working with a spirited young horse. Adam frowned slightly at the sight. "I wasn't expecting them today," he murmured, almost to himself. "Your workers?" Delia asked, curious, in a manner of speaking. "Thomas is my foreman. He lives in the smaller cabin with his wife, runs things when I'm away." Adam hesitated before adding, "The other man is Daniel, Thomas's younger brother. He helps out occasionally." There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those words, but before Delia could inquire further, Mrs. Simmons pulled up in her buggy, exclaiming over the beauty of the property. Adam helped both women down from their respective conveyances and led them toward the house. As they passed the corral, the man Adam had identified as Thomas called out a greeting. "Didn't expect you back so soon, boss," he said, a friendly grin splitting his weathered face. He was middle-aged with graying hair and the lean, tough build of a lifelong horseman. "Brought company, I see." "Thomas, this is Miss Winters and Mrs. Simmons from Oro Grande," Adam introduced. "Ladies, Thomas Clark, the best horse trainer in the territory and the real reason my operation succeeds." Thomas removed his hat and nodded respectfully to the women. "Pleasure, madam, miss." His gaze lingered curiously on Delia for a moment before returning to Adam. "Danny and I are just working with that new colt, showing promise." The younger man, Daniel, approached the fence. Delia was struck immediately by his appearance. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a boyish face and dark hair similar to Thomas's. But what caught her attention was the empty right sleeve of his shirt, pinned neatly at the shoulder. Daniel noticed her glance and lifted his chin slightly, as if daring her to comment or show pity. "Madam," he said simply, nodding to both women. "Daniel helps with the training," Adam explained, his tone matter of fact. "Has a way with the more spirited animals that even Thomas can't match." Delia watched as the young man returned to the colt, speaking softly to it, and using his single arm with remarkable dexterity to adjust the training lead. There was no awkwardness in his movements, only the confidence of someone who had adapted completely to his circumstance. "Perhaps you ladies would like to see the house first," Adam suggested. "Thomas's wife, Martha, has prepared some refreshments." The interior of Adam's home was a revelation. Delia had expected a bachelor's quarters functional but sparse. Instead, she found a comfortable, well-appointed home with good furniture, well-stocked bookshelves, and even some artwork on the walls. A piano stood in one corner of the main room, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight from a nearby window. "You play?" Delia asked, surprised. Adam shook his head. "It came with the house. I keep meaning to learn, but there never seems to be time." "Delia plays beautifully," Mrs. Simmons volunteered. "Perhaps she could demonstrate later." Martha Clark emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, a pleasant-faced woman with kind eyes who welcomed them warmly and insisted they sit while she served coffee and freshly baked bread with preserves. "It's so nice to have visitors," she said, beaming at Delia in particular. "Mr. Northrup keeps to himself so much that Thomas and I worry about him becoming a hermit entirely." "Martha," Adam admonished gently, though there was no real reproach in his tone. "Well, it's true," Martha insisted good-naturedly. "A man needs company sometimes, especially one as young as yourself." Mrs. Simmons and Martha fell into easy conversation, discovering mutual acquaintances from their respective pasts. Delia used the opportunity to study the books on Adam's shelves, an eclectic collection ranging from practical manuals on horse breeding to volumes of poetry and philosophy. "You've read all of these?" she asked, running her finger along the spine of a well-worn copy of Emerson's essays. "Most," Adam admitted, coming to stand beside her. Winter nights are long out here. Delia pulled the book from the shelf, opening it to find marginal notes in a neat, precise hand. You've annotated them as well. I wouldn't have taken you for such a scholar, Mr. Northrup. A hint of self-consciousness crossed Adam's face. A habit from my university days. My professors encouraged critical engagement with texts. Where did you study? Delia asked, genuinely curious about this new facet of the man who had rescued her. Harvard, Adam replied, watching carefully for her reaction. Civil engineering before the war interrupted everything. Delia's surprise must have shown on her face because Adam's expression closed slightly. Does that not fit with your image of a New Mexico horse breeder? On the contrary, Delia replied thoughtfully. It explains a great deal about you, the precision of your speech, the design of your ranch, even the way you've organized your library. She smiled. Though I admit I wouldn't have guessed Harvard specifically. Adam relaxed slightly, seeming pleased that she hadn't made more of the revelation. And you, Miss Winters, you're clearly educated yourself. Nothing so impressive as Harvard, Delia said with a small laugh. A ladies' seminary in Philadelphia. I studied literature, music, and enough mathematics to balance a shopkeeper's ledgers. Yet you ended up in a frontier town like Oro Grande. Life rarely follows our planned course, does it? Delia returned the book to its place on the shelf. I imagine you didn't set out to become a horse breeder in the New Mexico territory either. A shadow crossed Adam's face. No, that was an adaptation to circumstances. Before Delia could inquire further, Mrs. Simmons called out, "If you two are finished discussing literature, Martha has suggested we might like to see the new foals in the barn." The remainder of the afternoon passed pleasantly as Adam showed them around the ranch. Delia was particularly enchanted by the foals, 3 of them born within the past month, all showing the distinctive lines and intelligent eyes that marked Adam's breeding program. Daniel joined them in the barn, his initial reserve gradually giving way to enthusiasm as he described the special qualities of each young horse. Delia noticed how Adam deferred to the young man's opinions, treating him with a respect that spoke of more than mere employer-employee relations. "You have a real gift," Delia told Daniel after watching him quiet a nervous mare with just his voice and presence. "How did you come to work with horses?" A cloud passed over the young man's features. "Always loved them, madam, after Gettysburg." He gestured to his empty sleeve. "Didn't have many options. Mr. Northrup gave me a chance when others wouldn't." Delia glanced at Adam, who was deep in conversation with Thomas some distance away. "That was generous of him." Daniel's expression grew serious. "He's a good man, Miss Winters, better than most know. Saved my life in more ways than one." Before Delia could ask what he meant, Mrs. Simmons announced it was growing late, and they should start back to town before dusk. As they prepared to depart, Adam surprised Delia by asking if she might stay a little longer. "I thought perhaps you might like to try the piano," he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "And Martha has prepared more than enough for dinner. I could bring you back to town myself before it gets too late, Mrs. Simmons gave Delia a meaningful look, clearly torn between propriety and her desire to encourage what she clearly saw as a budding romance. "I suppose that would be acceptable," the older woman said finally. "So long as you return before full dark, mind you. People will talk regardless, but we needn't give them extra ammunition." After Mrs. Simmons departed in her buggy, a momentary awkwardness fell between Delia and Adam, as if both suddenly realized the intimacy of their situation. "Would you really like to hear me play?" Delia asked, breaking the silence. "I'm terribly out of practice." "I would," Adam replied simply. "Music is something my life has been lacking." Inside, Delia settled at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys to reacquaint herself with their feel. The instrument was surprisingly well-tuned for one that went unplayed. "Thomas's wife comes over sometimes to keep it in order," Adam explained, noticing her surprise. "She played in church back east before they moved west." Delia began with a simple folk melody, her fingers gradually remembering their training as she moved into more complex pieces, a Chopin nocturne, a simplified Mozart sonata. Adam stood by the window, watching her with an intensity that might have been discomfiting had it not been so appreciative. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment before saying, "I haven't heard music like that since before the war. Thank you." The simple sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside Delia. "It's a beautiful instrument. It deserves to be played more often." "Perhaps it will be," Adam said softly, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken question. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility, until Martha called from the kitchen that dinner was ready. The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from Martha's winter stores, and warm apple cobbler for dessert. Thomas and Daniel joined them, along with Martha, creating a congenial atmosphere that reminded Delia of family dinners from her childhood. As promised, Adam readied his horse to take Delia back to town as the afternoon light began to fade. He insisted she wear his heavy coat for the journey, despite her protests that she had her own. "The temperature drops quickly after sunset," he said, settling the coat around her shoulders. Its weight and warmth enveloped her immediately, along with the now familiar scent of leather and pine that she'd come to associate with Adam. "I don't want you catching a chill." The ride back to Oro Grande was mostly silent, but comfortably so. As they reached the outskirts of town, Delia found herself wishing the journey had been longer. "Thank you for today," she said as Adam helped her down from the mare in front of the general store. "I haven't enjoyed myself so much in a very long time." Adam took the coat she offered back to him, his fingers briefly brushing hers in the exchange. "The pleasure was mine, Delia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Perhaps," she began hesitantly, "perhaps you might come to dinner here sometime. Mr. and Mrs. Simmons would be delighted to have you again, I'm sure." Adam considered this for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that, though I can't promise when. The spring foaling season keeps me busy." "Whenever you can," Delia said, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "The invitation stands." As she watched him ride away, Delia acknowledged to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. Her feelings for Adam Northrup had progressed far beyond gratitude or curiosity. She was falling in love with the quiet, complex man who had saved her from the blizzard, and in doing so, had perhaps begun to thaw his own isolated existence as well. What she couldn't know was that Adam, riding back to his ranch under the emerging stars, was wrestling with the same realization and the fear that accompanied it. For a man who had chosen solitude as a shield against past pain, the prospect of opening his heart again was more terrifying than any blizzard. Spring arrived in earnest across the New Mexico territory, transforming the landscape with vibrant wildflowers and the fresh green of new growth. In Oro Grande, the change in seasons brought increased activity: freight wagons arriving more frequently, travelers passing through on their way further west, and ranchers coming to town to replenish supplies after the winter months. For Delia, spring brought a blossoming of her own feelings for Adam Northrup, nurtured by his increasingly regular visits to town. True to his word, he had accepted several invitations to dine with the Simmons, and had even escorted Delia to a small social gathering at the church. Though he remained reserved among larger groups, she noticed how he was gradually becoming more at ease, exchanging pleasantries with townspeople who had once regarded him with suspicion. What Delia treasured most, however, were the quiet conversations they shared when he arrived early for dinner or lingered afterward. Adam revealed himself slowly, like a book whose pages turned only a few at a time: his childhood in Boston as the son of a prosperous merchant, his passionate interest in bridge design that had led him to engineering studies, his reluctant enlistment when the war made civilian pursuits impossible. Yet there remained significant chapters of his life that Adam kept firmly closed, particularly his experiences during and after his military service. Delia sensed these were wounds still too raw to expose, and she respected his reticence, content to know the man he was now rather than dwell on the past that had shaped him. Not everyone in Oro Grande viewed Adam's increasing presence with approval. Sheriff Jackson, in particular, seemed to resent the developing relationship between Delia and the rancher. His own pursuit of Delia had become more determined, despite her gentle but consistent rebuffs. "I don't understand what you see in him," Jackson remarked one afternoon when he'd cornered Delia alone in the store. "A man with secrets is a man who can't be trusted." "We all have parts of ourselves we prefer to keep private, Sheriff," Delia replied, busying herself with inventory to avoid meeting his increasingly hostile gaze. "That doesn't make us untrustworthy. There's private, and then there's suspicious," Jackson persisted. "Did you know he was investigated after leaving the cavalry? There were questions about his conduct. This was new information, and despite herself, Delia paused in her work. "What kind of questions?" Jackson seemed pleased to have captured her attention. "The kind that follow a man who abandons his post right before a major engagement. The kind that wonder how a former officer suddenly has the means to purchase land and livestock when others struggle to make ends meet." "I'm sure there are perfectly reasonable explanations," Delia said, resuming her counting with deliberate focus. "Are you?" Jackson moved closer, lowering his voice. "Has he offered them to you, or are you so bewitched by him that you don't even ask?" Delia set down her pencil and turned to face him directly. "Sheriff Jackson, I appreciate your concern, misplaced though it may be, but my associations are my own business. Now, if there's something you need to purchase, I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, I have work to do." Jackson's face hardened, but he tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Just looking out for a respected member of our community, Miss Winters. Time will tell which of us has the right measure of your Mr. Northrup." After he left, Delia found her hands were shaking slightly. Jackson's insinuations, while unwelcome, had planted seeds of uncertainty that she couldn't entirely dismiss. What did she really know about Adam's past? Why had he left the cavalry before Little Bighorn? Where had his money come from? Yet even as these questions arose, Delia found herself recalling Daniel's words at the ranch. "He's a good man, Miss Winters, better than most know." She thought of how Adam treated his workers with respect, how gently he handled his horses, how he had risked his own safety to rescue a stranger in a blizzard. Whatever secrets Adam kept, Delia believed in the essential goodness of the man she had come to know. Still, she couldn't deny a growing desire to understand the full story of Adam Northrup, not out of doubt, but from a desire to know completely the man she was falling in love with. The opportunity to broach the subject came sooner than she expected. The following Saturday, Adam arrived at the store just before closing, looking uncharacteristically agitated. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "Privately, if possible." Concerned by his serious demeanor, Delia quickly finished with her last customer and locked the door, turning the sign to closed. "What's wrong?" she asked, leading him to the small office at the back of the store where they could speak without being observed through the windows. Adam paced the small space, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair in a gesture Delia had come to recognize as a sign of inner turmoil. "Sheriff Jackson came to my ranch today," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He brought a federal marshal with him." Delia's heart sank. What did they want, officially? To inspect my horses for an army contract. Adam's laugh held no humor. Unofficially, to snoop around and ask questions about my past, my finances, my business dealings. The marshal even hinted at an investigation into stolen army property. "That's absurd," Delia protested. "You've built your ranch through honest work. Anyone who's seen your operation would know that." Adam stopped pacing and looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "How can you be so certain? You barely know me, Delia." The challenge in his voice took her aback. "I know enough," she said softly. "I know the kind of man who would risk his life to save a stranger in a blizzard. I know the kind of man who gives opportunity to someone like Daniel when others would only see his limitation." Something in Adam's expression shifted, the anger giving way to a vulnerability that made him look younger, less guarded. "Jackson thinks I've deceived you, that I've." He hesitated, seeming to struggle with the words, "taken advantage of your gratitude. And have you?" Delia asked, holding his gaze steadily. "No," Adam replied without hesitation. "If anything, I've kept my distance more than." He stopped abruptly. "More than what?" Delia pressed gently. "More than I wanted to," Adam admitted, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Because I'm not the man you think I am, Delia. I'm not the hero you've made me out to be. Delia moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Then tell me who you really are, she said. I'm not asking for a hero, Adam. I'm asking for the truth. For a long moment, Adam stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once decisively. Not here, he said. Tomorrow, come to the ranch. I'll tell you everything then. Delia wanted to protest the delay, but something in his manner told her this was not a story that could be rushed or told in the confines of a small office with potential interruptions. Tomorrow, she agreed. I'll come after church. Adam reached out then, his hand hesitating before gently touching her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Thank you, he said simply, before replacing his hat and taking his leave. Delia barely slept that night, her mind spinning with possibilities. What secrets could be so difficult for Adam to share? Was she prepared to hear them? And more importantly, would they change how she felt about him? By the time she rode out to Adam's ranch the following afternoon, Delia had resolved to listen with an open mind and heart, remembering the essential goodness she had witnessed in the man regardless of what his past might hold. Adam was waiting for her on the porch, rising to his feet as she approached. He helped her dismount, his touch lingering slightly longer than necessary, as if drawing strength from the contact. Thomas and Martha have gone to visit their daughter in Santa Fe, he explained as he led her inside. We'll have privacy. The house felt different without the bustling presence of the Clarks, quieter, more intimate. Adam gestured for Delia to sit on the sofa while he remained standing, his tall figure tense with restrained energy. Before I begin, he said, his voice carefully controlled, I want you to know that I've never spoken of these things to anyone except Thomas, not the full story. Delia nodded, folding her hands in her lap to keep from reaching out to him. I'm honored by your trust. Adam took a deep breath, then began his tale. After the war, I joined the cavalry because it seemed the only path available to me. My family had lost everything, my father's shipping business destroyed by Confederate raiders, his health broken by the loss. Engineering jobs were scarce, and the Army offered a commission based on my education. He moved to the window, looking out at his land as he continued. I was assigned to the Dakota Territory under Custer. At first, it seemed straightforward: protect settlers, escort survey teams for the railroad. But then the orders changed. We were sent to force tribes onto reservations to clear land for white settlement regardless of prior treaties. Adam's voice grew harder. I witnessed atrocities, Delia. Villages burned, women and children killed, not in the heat of battle, but deliberately. Systematically. He turned to face her, his expression haunted. I followed orders at first, telling myself it was my duty, but each incident eroded something inside me until I could barely recognize the man I'd become. Delia remained silent, understanding that he needed to tell this story without interruption. There was a Lakota encampment, Adam continued, his voice now barely audible, peaceful. They'd been promised protection in exchange for information about other tribes. Custer ordered us to relocate them, but the real intention was clear to those of us who had seen this pattern before. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I refused the order, argued with Custer directly. It cost me my commission. I was discharged for insubordination, narrowly avoiding court-martial only because of my previous record. What happened to the Lakota camp? Delia asked softly. Pain flashed across Adam's features. Wiped out 3 days after I left. Men, women, children. He closed his eyes briefly. I later learned that Daniel and Thomas were there. Daniel as a young cavalry recruit, Thomas as a civilian scout. Daniel lost his arm trying to save a Lakota child from a burning tipi. The official report called it an accident. Delia felt sick at the revelation, but kept her expression composed, sensing there was more to come. After my discharge, I drifted for a while, haunted by what I'd been part of and what I'd failed to prevent. Then I received word that my father had died, leaving me a small inheritance, not enough to restart his business, but enough to begin something new, somewhere far from the memories. Adam's expression changed, a new intensity entering his eyes. I found Thomas and Daniel in a mining camp in Colorado. Daniel was dying from infection in his amputation, rejected by the army and unable to work. Thomas was at the end of his rope, trying to care for his brother while keeping them both fed. You helped them, Delia said, beginning to understand the deep bond between the men. Adam nodded. I paid for a proper doctor for Daniel, offered them both work once he recovered. Thomas had experience with horses, and Daniel showed an aptitude despite his injury. When I found this property for sale, they came with me. He fell silent then, watching her face carefully for her reaction. So now you know, he said finally. I'm not a hero, Delia. I'm a man who followed unconscionable orders for too long before finding the courage to refuse. A man who couldn't save an entire encampment but tried to make amends by saving 2 lives instead. Delia rose from the sofa and moved to stand before him. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Adam Northrup? She asked, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. I see a man who found his conscience when others abandoned theirs. A man who chose the harder right over the easier wrong. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The world is full of people who never question orders, never examine the morality of their actions. You did both, at great personal cost. Adam caught her hand in his grip almost painfully tight. Sheriff Jackson believes I stole army funds or equipment, that my ranch was built on ill-gotten gains. And did you? Delia asked, already knowing the answer. No, Adam replied firmly. My father's inheritance was modest but legal. Everything else has come from honest work, breeding and training horses. Then you have nothing to fear from investigations, Delia said with simple confidence. Adam shook his head slightly, wonder in his expression. How can you still look at me that way, knowing what I was part of? Because I'm looking at who you are now, and the journey you took to become that man, Delia replied. We're all shaped by our choices, Adam, both the ones we regret and the ones that redeem us. Something broke in Adam's carefully maintained composure. He pulled Delia into his arms, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shifting sand. She returned his embrace without hesitation, her heart swelling with the certainty that this was where she belonged. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you wrapped your coat around me in that blizzard, she whispered against his chest. Adam drew back enough to look into her face, his eyes searching hers as if scarcely daring to believe what he'd heard. Delia, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. Then he was kissing her, his mouth finding hers with a tenderness that quickly deepened into something more urgent, more passionate. Delia responded in kind, her arms twining around his neck, her body melting against his as years of solitude and loneliness dissolved in the heat of their embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Adam rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I think I've been fighting it since the day I found you in the snow, afraid that I didn't deserve someone like you. Then stop fighting, Delia told him, her fingers threading through his hair, because I'm not going anywhere. In that moment, as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of a home built from redemption and second chances, Adam and Delia found themselves at the beginning of a new chapter 1 they would write together, with all the honesty, courage, and love they had each discovered in the other. The weeks that followed Adam's revelation brought both challenges and deepening bonds for the couple. True to his word, the federal marshal conducted a thorough investigation into Adam's business dealings, interviewing suppliers, examining financial records, and questioning former cavalry associates. Though the process was intrusive, and at times humiliating, Adam endured it with a quiet dignity that impressed even his critics. Delia stood firmly by his side throughout, her unwavering support a source of strength that surprised Adam with its impact. He had grown so accustomed to facing life's battles alone that the experience of having someone fight alongside him was both unfamiliar and profoundly moving. When the marshal finally delivered his findings, no evidence of wrongdoing, all assets legitimately acquired, the relief was palpable. Sheriff Jackson maintained a sullen suspicion, but without official backing, his insinuations gradually lost their sting. As spring matured into early summer, Adam and Delia's courtship blossomed in full view of the Oro Grande community. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the Simmons table, and were often seen riding along the peaceful trails surrounding the town. Adam even participated in the town's modest 4th of July celebration, donating one of his finest yearlings for the raffle that funded the new schoolhouse roof. For Delia, watching Adam gradually integrate into the life of the community brought a joy she hadn't anticipated. The reserved, solitary man who had rescued her from the blizzard was still there, but alongside him emerged a man capable of dry humor, thoughtful conversation, and occasional surprising gestures of generosity. "You've changed him, Mrs. Simmons remarked one evening as they watched Adam deep in conversation with Mr. Simmons about a book both had read. Or perhaps more accurately, you've allowed him to change himself. "I think he was ready," Delia replied softly. "He just needed someone to believe he deserved a place among decent people again." "And do you think Oro Grande will be that place?" Mrs. Simmons asked, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "Or will it be that ranch of his?" The question touched on thoughts Delia had been carefully avoiding. Her life was in town, working at the store, living in the small apartment she'd made her own. Adam's life was his ranch, his horses, the redemptive purpose he'd built there. Neither could simply abandon their respective worlds without significant sacrifice. "I don't know," Delia admitted. "We haven't discussed it." Mrs. Simmons patted her hand knowingly. "You will, dear. These things have a way of demanding resolution when the time is right." That time came sooner than Delia expected. The following Sunday, after church, Adam suggested they ride to a spot he wanted to show her, a small mesa overlooking a verdant valley about halfway between town and his ranch. "It's beautiful here," Delia said as they dismounted, taking in the panoramic view of mountains in the distance, the ribbon of river below, and the scattered homesteads that marked human presence in the vast landscape. "It is," Adam agreed, spreading a blanket on a flat rock for them to sit on. From his saddlebag, he produced a simple picnic bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of cider. "I come here sometimes to think, to remind myself why I chose this place." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze and the song of meadowlarks in the grass around them. When they had finished, Adam took Delia's hand in his expression growing serious. "I've been thinking about us," he began, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "About our future." Delia's heart quickened. They had exchanged words of love, shared increasingly passionate embraces, but had not yet spoken concretely about what might come next. "So have I," she admitted. Adam seemed to steel himself, as if preparing for a difficult conversation. "I know your life is in town. Your work, your friends, the community you've built there. I would never ask you to give that up." "Just as I would never ask you to give up your ranch," Delia responded. "It's not just your livelihood, it's your purpose, your redemption." Adam nodded, his expression grave. "So we find ourselves at an impasse. Do we?" Delia asked, studying his face. "Is there truly no middle ground to be found?" A small smile tugged at the corner of Adam's mouth. "That's what I wanted to show you." He gestured toward a gentle slope about half a mile distant, where a stand of cottonwood trees provided shade beside a small creek. "That land is for sale. 40 acres with water rights. It borders my property to the south." Delia looked where he was pointing, confusion giving way to understanding. "You want to buy more land. I want to build a home there," Adam clarified, his eyes never leaving hers. "Our home, if you'll have me." The breath caught in Delia's throat as she realized what he was saying. "Adam." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the sunlight. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "My father gave it to her when they were young and had nothing but dreams and each other." Adam slid from the blanket onto one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Delia Winters, you found me when I was lost in more ways than I can count. You saw goodness in me when I'd forgotten it existed. You brought light back into a life I'd resigned to shadows." He held up the ring, his hand steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" Build a life with me that bridges both our worlds." Tears welled in Delia's eyes, blurring her vision but not the certainty in her heart. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Adam. I will." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was pulling her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love, hope, and promise that words could never fully express. Delia returned his embrace with equal fervor, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When they finally drew apart, breathless and laughing, Adam pressed his forehead to hers. "I never dared to hope for this," he confessed. "For you. For a chance to build something good and true after everything that came before." Delia cradled his face in her hands, overwhelmed by the depth of her love for this complex, honorable man. That's what life is, isn't it? The chance to begin again, to create something beautiful even from the ashes of what was lost. They spent the remainder of the afternoon planning their shared future, a new home built halfway between town and the ranch, allowing Delia to continue working at the store while being closer to Adam's operation. They would marry in the fall, after the busiest season for both their respective work. Thomas would expand his responsibilities at the ranch, with Daniel continuing to train the horses that had become his passion and expertise. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Adam wrapped his coat around Delia's shoulders to ward off the evening chill. The gesture, so reminiscent of their first meeting, brought a smile to her lips. "What is it?" Adam asked, noticing her expression. "I was just thinking about that blizzard," Delia replied, leaning against his shoulder as they prepared to mount their horses for the ride back. How something so dangerous, so frightening, could ultimately lead to this moment. Adam's arm tightened around her waist. "I made you a promise that day to keep you safe. I intend to keep it for the rest of our lives. And I intend to hold you to it," Delia said, turning in his embrace to meet his gaze. "Just as I promised to stand beside you through whatever storms may come." Their wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the aspens in the surrounding hills already beginning to turn gold against the evergreen backdrop. The entire town of Oro Grande had been buzzing with preparations for weeks, the first major wedding celebration, since the Peterson girl had married the blacksmith's son the previous spring. The church had been decorated with wildflowers and autumn foliage, gathered by a committee of ladies headed by Mrs. Simmons, who had taken on the role of surrogate mother to the bride with enthusiasm, and no small amount of emotional investment. Mr. Simmons would give Delia away, an honor that had brought tears to the usually reserved shopkeeper's eyes when she'd asked him. In the small back room of the church that served as a bridal chamber, Delia stood before a mirror, scarcely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Her dress, ordered from a Denver dressmaker at Mrs. Simmons' insistence, was more elegant than anything she'd ever owned, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, its simple lines perfect for her slender frame. Martha Clark had arranged Delia's chestnut hair in an intricate style adorned with tiny white flowers, and a borrowed veil completed the transformation from shopkeeper to bride. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Simmons declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Your parents would be so proud." Delia touched the locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she wore besides her engagement ring. Inside were miniature portraits of her mother and father, allowing them to be with her in spirit on this most important day. "I hope so," she said softly, a momentary sadness passing through her at the thought of all they had missed. But it quickly gave way to the joy that had been her constant companion since Adam's proposal. A knock at the door announced Mr. Simmons, looking distinguished in his best suit, his usually serious face alight with pleasure. "It's time, my dear. Are you ready?" Delia took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts one last time. "More than ready." The small church was filled to capacity, townspeople crowded into pews alongside ranchers from the surrounding area. Thomas and Martha Clark sat in the front row, Daniel beside them looking uncomfortable but proud in a new suit. Even Sheriff Jackson had come, his initial hostility toward Adam having gradually given way to a grudging respect over the months of courthouse construction, where Adam's engineering expertise had proven invaluable to the town council. As the first notes of music began played by the schoolteacher on the church's wheezy organ, all heads turned toward the back of the church, where Delia appeared on Mr. Simmons' arm. But Delia had eyes only for the man waiting at the altar. Adam stood tall and straight in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his expression that caught at Delia's heart, a look of such wonder and love that she felt her steps quicken of their own accord, eager to reach him, to begin their life together. When Mr. Simmons placed her hand in Adam's, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, saw the emotion he fought to control reflected in the brightness of his eyes. This strong, reserved man who had faced war, wilderness, and his own demons was moved to the core by their union. The minister's words washed over them sacred promises of love, honor, and faithfulness that they repeated with clear, unwavering voices. When Adam placed a simple gold band beside the sapphire engagement ring on Delia's finger, his hand was steady, his gaze certain. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Adam's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a perfect balance of reverence and passion that spoke volumes about the man Delia had chosen to spend her life with. When they turned to face their assembled friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Northrup, the applause and cheers that filled the small church reflected the community's wholehearted embrace of their union. The celebration continued at the town hall, transformed with lanterns and autumn decorations for the occasion. There was music from a local fiddle player, dancing, and a feast contributed to by nearly every household in Oro Grande. Adam, who once would have found such a gathering unbearable, moved among their guests with unexpected ease, his natural dignity and quiet courtesy winning over even those who had once viewed him with suspicion. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away to begin the journey to their new home. Construction had been completed just days before a charming two-story structure nestled among the cottonwoods by the creek, exactly where Adam had pointed out on the day of his proposal. It incorporated the best of both their worlds, the solid craftsmanship of a ranch house with the refined touches that reflected Delia's more genteel background. Adam lifted Delia from her horse at the threshold, cradling her in his arms as he carried her across it, in accordance with tradition. Inside, lamps had been lit, a fire laid in the hearth, and flowers placed in vases throughout the rooms Martha's doing, ensuring everything was perfect for their arrival. "Welcome home, Mrs. Northrup," Adam said, setting Delia gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Delia looked up at him, her heart so full of love she could scarcely find words. "Our home," she whispered, "our beginning." Later, as moonlight streamed through the windows of their bedroom, Delia lay in the circle of Adam's arms, her head pillowed on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The final barrier between them had fallen away, their bodies joining in the most intimate expression of the love that had grown between them since that fateful day in the blizzard. "What are you thinking?" Adam asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. Delia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, marveling at the relaxed contentment in his face, so different from the guarded expression he had worn when they first met. "I was thinking about promises," she said, trailing her fingers along the line of his jaw. "The one you made when you found me in the snow, the ones we made today in the church," she smiled, "and all the ones still to come." Adam caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I intend to keep every one of them." "I know," Delia said simply. "That's who you are." As they drifted towards sleep in each other's arms, Delia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance encounter in a blizzard to a love that had healed old wounds and opened the door to new possibilities. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, wrapped in the warmth of a promise that had begun with a coat shared in a storm and would last for all the days to come. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the air as Adam watched his 3-year-old son, William, attempt to climb onto the back of an exceptionally patient old mare. Thomas stood nearby, one hand ready to catch the boy if needed, while Daniel offered encouragement from the fence. "Not so fast, Billy," Adam called out. using the nickname that had stuck despite Delia's occasional protests that it wasn't dignified enough. "Remember what Uncle Daniel taught you about approaching from the side?" The boy nodded solemnly, his dark hair so like his father's falling into eyes that were the exact shade of his mother's blue. With exaggerated care, he repositioned himself and tried again, his small face lighting up with triumph when he managed to scramble onto the saddle. "Look, Papa, I did it." "Well done," Adam acknowledged, pride swelling in his chest. "Now sit up straight just like we practiced." From the porch of the main house, Delia watched the scene with a smile, her 8-month-old daughter, Elizabeth, cradled in her arms. The baby was fighting sleep, her tiny fists waving in protest even as her eyelids drooped. "Stubborn, just like her father," Delia murmured affectionately, rocking gently in the chair Adam had built when she was pregnant with William. The last 5 years had brought changes both expected and surprising. Their home had expanded along with their family, a new wing added for the children, a larger kitchen for the gatherings they frequently hosted. Adam's horse breeding operation had grown as well, earning a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as California. Oro Grande had changed too, nearly doubling in size as the railroad's arrival 3 years earlier brought new settlers and opportunities. Delia still worked at the general store 2 days a week, now as a partner rather than an employee, having used her inheritance from the Simmons who had retired to Denver the previous year to buy into the business. The sound of hoofbeats approaching drew Delia's attention. A rider came into view, Sheriff Jackson, who had finally laid aside his suspicions of Adam after the latter had led a volunteer group to rescue Jackson's younger brother when he was lost in the mountains during a blizzard 2 winters past. The two men would never be close friends, but they had developed a mutual respect that served the community well. "Afternoon, Mrs. Northrup," Jackson called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Is your husband about?" "In the corral with Billy," Delia replied, nodding toward where Adam was now demonstrating proper rein handling to his enraptured son. "Everything all right, Sheriff?" "Just fine, madam. Got word from the Army procurement officer. They're increasing their order for next season. Seems Northrup horses have been outperforming all others in the field trials." Pride warmed Delia's heart as she watched Jackson make his way to the corral to deliver the news. Adam's dedication to ethical breeding and training practices had paid off, vindicating his approach and securing their future in the process. As if sensing her thoughts, Adam looked up from his conversation with the sheriff, his eyes finding hers across the distance. Even now, after 5 years of marriage, the connection between them remained as powerful as it had been that day in the blizzard, a lifeline of understanding and love that had only grown stronger through the challenges and joys they had shared. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the day's visitors had departed, Adam and Delia sat together on the porch swing he had built as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. The air was cool but not cold, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. "I heard about the Army contract," Delia said, leaning against Adam's shoulder. "Congratulations, you've built something remarkable here." "We have," Adam corrected gently, his arm tightening around her. "None of it would exist without you." Delia smiled, knowing it was true in ways beyond the practical partnership they had forged. "Do you ever think about it? How different our lives might have been if I hadn't gotten caught in that blizzard, if you hadn't come along when you did?" Adam was quiet for a moment, contemplative. "I used to believe life was just a series of random events, some fortunate, some tragic, with no particular meaning behind them." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "Now I'm not so sure. There are too many moments that seem destined somehow. Like a blizzard that brings together two people who needed each other more than they knew," Delia suggested. "Exactly like that," Adam agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I could have done without the near-freezing part," Delia laughed softly. "As I recall, you had a rather effective solution for that problem." "My coat," Adam mused, a smile in his voice. "I still have it, you know, hanging in the back of the closet." "I know," Delia said. "I see you looking at it sometimes, with that expression you get when you're remembering something important." Adam turned to face her more fully, the depths of his eyes reflecting all they had become to one another. "It reminds me of promises kept," he said simply, "and of how the worst day can become the beginning of the best life, if you're fortunate enough to find the right person to share it with." As the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking softly of small daily matters and larger dreams for their children's futures. The house behind them stood warm and welcoming, filled with the sleeping breaths of the family they had created. Beyond it, the land stretched toward distant horizons, a testament to second chances and the power of love to transform lives once thought beyond redemption. And in the gentle sway of the porch swing, in the comfort of each other's embrace, Adam and Delia Northrup found the fulfillment of a promise made years before, when she had stood alone in a blizzard, and he had wrapped her in his coat and his heart.